Okay, this screencast will conclude our Chapter 28 notes, picking up with Ronald Reagan, who was elected in the election of 1980, ousting the incumbent Jimmy Carter. He was a Republican, a very conservative Republican, and he's going to kind of transform the economy at this point through a policy known as Reaganomics. Now, if you recall, our economy had not been doing that great in the 1970s due to stagflation, which we talked about underneath Nixon's presidency. And so he implemented this policy, nicknamed Reaganomics, to try to address the poor economy and try to fix it. So it consisted of budget cuts and tax cuts, kind of hoping that by reducing government spending and reducing the amount of taxes that Americans were paying, that money would naturally flow in the economy. It would encourage investment, and we would see growth over time, and people profiting like on an individual level as well. The theory was, the more money that even like big corporations can keep, the more they will invest in their business, they will hire more people, then those people have more money, they'll go out and spend their money, that money will get invested, other people will make money off of new jobs that are created because of that. So the theory is that the money would naturally cycle. Truthfully though, the top percent of the population did see growth over the next decade, while the middle and lower classes didn't really have much growth overall. The bigger issue is that this policy actually greatly contributed to our national debt, because while Reagan did implement budget cuts to make up for the tax cuts, he also increased defense spending, which had a negative effect on our deficit. The next story we're going to talk about is a bit lengthy, and I just want to preface it by saying it's not necessary to know each detail of the events taking place in Nicaragua. Rather, I want to tell you this story because I think it helps understand the U.S.'s continual involvement in foreign affairs, especially those in our own region, in this case, Latin America. We've addressed this a little bit with the Cold War context, obviously, us getting involved in communist countermeasures, but this just kind of shows you how involved the U.S. had become throughout the 1900s, kind of starting decades before even Reagan's president. So I wrote down all the names of the people involved, but don't think you have to memorize this for the tests. So basically, in the 1930s, the U.S. helped a man named Anastasio Somoza, the Somoza family, come to power in Nicaragua. He was cooperative with us, so we saw him put in power. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a dictator who, his family would rule Nicaragua for the rest of, the mid 1900s for the next 42 years. And basically to keep control, he would initiate rigged elections. He would assassinate political rivals. So pretty much he and his family are not a good regime in charge of Nicaragua during this time. There are several rebellions attempting to overthrow the Somoza family, and they're going through basically a series of civil wars between the Somoza military and a group of rebels called the Sandinistas. Maybe because of some guilt that we instated the Somozas in the first place, but President Carter in the 1970s would help support the Sandinistas by sending millions of dollars in aid. But unfortunately, the Soviet Union and Cuba would also send money to the Sandinistas. Now, why do you think those countries would send economic relief to a group of rebels in Nicaragua? Perhaps they want to implement communism if that group was to take over. And indeed, they do. So now the Sandinistas are a communist regime. Because of that, when Reagan takes office in 1981, he basically cuts all aid to the Sandinista government, and he starts supporting a second rebellion group known as the Contras. These rebels were not communists. They used guerrilla warfare tactics, and they were against the Sandinistas. So we start funding that military. Within 2 years, that Contra army had grown to over 10,000 men, and the CIA and other American leaders are basically directly in charge of their operations without congressional approval. Now, we have a sour taste in our mouths because of the events of what happened in Vietnam with the CIA, with the president able to, grow and take action without congressional approval. So Congress wants to put a stop to that and they passed what's called the Boland Amendment, which banned any sort of military aid to the Contras for a certain number of years. But Reagan actually found loopholes in this. So that kind of cost him some support, but people didn't find out about it until his vice president, George H.W. Bush, had become president in 1988. So he kind of got away with it at the time. In 1990, Nicaragua had an election and a Contra supporter was elected, so the U.S. did get its way here, but I just kind of wanted to, again, show you how presidents such as Reagan had continued to get involved in international affairs, including those in the Latin American region. The rest of this screencast is going to focus on the HIV/AIDS crisis, which is our last topic and will include our final resistor and dissenter. So AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. It is caused by HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus. This is all an overview, by the way, before we get into the timeline, but I wanted to kind of get into an overview of what HIV/AIDS is. AIDS attacks T cells, which are the white blood cells that help the body to fight off infections. They're very essential cells. So with those white helper cells affected, people, a small illness could make people basically deathly ill. And so the disease is fatal, and it can be fatal. It's spread multiple ways. It is obviously an STD, a sexually transmitted disease. But people also can contract HIV/AIDS through blood transfusions, through contact, like with open lesions, like if someone has a cut and someone else has a cut and there's contact made, that can transmit AIDS. A mother can pass it to their baby in utero. Also, needles are a way of transmitting AIDS, HIV/AIDS, because obviously the blood contact. But the thing with the needles is that there's obviously a lot of like heavy drug use happening in the 1960s and 70s, so that was a common method of transmitting AIDS. It was likely spread from chimpanzees to humans at the turn of the 20th century, which is like between the 18 and 1900s. But it wasn't discovered by doctors until the very early 1980s. So to kind of give you a timeline here, in 1981, doctors saw its first observed like cluster cases of HIV/AIDS. By 82, they actually have a name for the disease, AIDS. By 83, the CDC warned national blood banks that there perhaps could be contaminated blood, like in the U.S. blood banks and blood storage, but unfortunately there was no method to test the blood for these remnants at this point. So they were just warning the blood banks by 83. By 1984, HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, was discovered as the method of where AIDS came from. And by 1985, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, officially develops the HIV antibody tests. And with that test, they do begin to start screening U.S. blood supply and blood banks. And it is discovered that contaminated infected blood was in the blood banks, meaning that people had transmitted the disease and, gotten the disease that way. We're now going to kind of transition to an interesting connection and correlation between homophobia existing at this point and HIV/AIDS. And I just want to kind of talk about, as a preface really quickly, that, obviously the Catholic Church has a certain stance, towards, in regards to the practicing of homosexuality. With that being said, Catholic, catechism and doctrine makes it clear that people who are homosexual are to be treated with dignity and respect. And so I want to just make it clear that we're going to talk about some examples where they were not treated with dignity and respect, and that is not in line with Catholic doctrine. So before AIDS was officially discovered as the culprit of this developing illness discovered in the early 80s, some identified it as a quote-unquote type of gay cancer, as you see in this article on the screen. There was this perception of a connection between homosexuality and this new lethal disease. Now, homosexuals were by far not the only people to be affected by AIDS, but because of unprotected sexual activity, they were affected in high numbers. Initially, actually, before it's officially discovered what's causing these illnesses and the deaths, the disease was identified as GRID, G-R-I-D, or gay-related immune deficiency. It's fairly obvious that there was a national crisis developing with a high illness count and a high death count, but there wasn't a lot of government response and no one was really acknowledging what was happening. And many people feel that this was because of an essence of homophobia existing in the 80s when the new right and the conservative, the new moral majority was kind of coming into power and popularity. For example, the leader of the moral majority group we addressed earlier in this chapter, Jerry Falwell, he argued at one point that, quote unquote, AIDS is the wrath of God against homosexuals, almost implying that it was okay and acceptable for the government to not be responding because people were getting what was coming to them. And again, that is so false and so against what our church teaches and believes in. Excuse me. Not to mention that homosexuals were by far not the only people to contract AIDS, and that was eventually referenced and recognized in the end. But in the very beginning, this was a problem. Reagan finally mentions AIDS publicly in a major speech in 1987, but by that point, there had already been over 40,500 deaths. That's 40,849 deaths to be exact. You can kind of look at this timeline here, year by year, the number of reported cases and the number of deaths reported that year. You can pause these screens if you want to see this in shorter time. This is what I just referenced with Reagan first finally mentioning AIDS, in a major speech in 1987. So it took a very long time for the government to respond to this crisis that was happening. Our final resistor and dissenter is an organization known as ACT UP. They are a political action group organized in response to the AIDS crisis. The group's first action took place in the spring of 1987. It was a march on Wall Street in order to protest the high cost and lack of availability of HIV treatment drugs. They engaged in direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience, such as holding protests and direct action demonstrations in the late 80s, early 90s. This would include protesting, shutting down or causing dramatic interruption at places like Wall Street, the FDA, the CDC, and other pharmaceutical companies and organizations. Just basically demanding a response and an acknowledgement that this was a crisis and that we needed to work with modern medicine to find a solution. They would hold what were called die-ins, which is kind of an alternative to sit-ins that we saw in the civil rights movement. People would literally gather and, in public places and literally fall on the ground, interrupt traffic, interrupt parkways, other public places as just a method of showing how many people were actually dying in response to this crisis. They demand treatment, they demand more research, they demand more funding. And we eventually do see success in the mid-1990s. In 1996, a drug is developed known as an effective antiretroviral therapy. It's discovered and approved by the FDA and made available to AIDS patients. And for the first time, we start seeing the number of Americans dying from AIDS decline, dropping 23% from the previous year. Because from the 80s through the mid-90s, every year more and more Americans were dying from this disease. It really had become a true crisis on a national level and an international level as well. The decline is attributed because of these new combination therapies, basically helping the white cells stabilize and not spread, so the disease not being allowed to spread so quickly. And honestly, without ACT UP, these drugs would have taken many more years to arrive because it's because of people demanding that the government address the problem and look into research and look into response that they actually do respond and develop these drugs that do help people have a high life expectancy if they contract the disease, because the disease is still happening today, but because of these drugs, they are less fatal than they were in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. The story does not end here, though. AIDS continues to be a serious epidemic. Globally, there are an estimated 37 million people that are thought to have the virus, whether they know or not. And this chart just kind of shows you the development into the 2000. So you see that there's still more people contracting it and living with it, but less people dying by percentage. Okay, as we will discuss at a later time. Okay, if you have any questions, please write them down, and I will see you all on Monday.